Downsizing you, not the house." He said it standing in the doorway of the room I'd slept in for 8 years, clipboard in hand like he was managing a corporate relocation instead of talking about his own father. "We're downsizing you, not the house, Dad. It'll be temporary." My successful son had a 5-bedroom colonial and a wife who wanted a home gym. My good-for-nothing daughter had a 1-bedroom apartment, and she gave me the only bedroom in it without me even. I'm 71 years old, and I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this. This isn't a story about square footage. It's a story about which one of your children measures your worth in the space you take up, and which one simply makes room. Let me back up. I live, or lived, in a 5-bedroom colonial outside Richmond, Virginia, that belongs to my son Marcus and his wife Priya. 8 years ago, after my wife Donna passed and I sold the house we'd raised our children in, Marcus told me there was plenty of room, that I'd have my own space, my own bathroom, a real window with a view of their backyard. I gave him $85,000 from the sale of my house toward his down payment on that colonial, because that's what you do for family, and because he assured me more than once that this was our house now, not just his. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late spring, warm enough that I'd had my window cracked all morning, when Marcus knocked on my door holding a clipboard, an actual clipboard, with a floor plan sketched on it in Priya's careful handwriting. "Dad," he said, "we need to talk about some changes. Welcome to Brian's revenge." If that opening's already got a knot forming in your stomach, that's exactly where I need you. Hit that like button, tell me where you're watching from, and stay with me, because what happened over the following months is going to show you exactly what my son didn't know was sitting in a filing cabinet from 8 years ago. Marcus is 44 now, does well for himself managing commercial properties across 3 counties, the kind of son who remembers Father's Day and forgets almost everything else about actually being a son. Priya's pregnant with their 2nd child, and somewhere in the excitement of that news, they decided the room I'd occupied for 8 years, the good one, with the window and the attached bath, would make a better nursery than the smaller room down the hall currently used for Priya's home gym equipment. "We're downsizing you, not the house, Dad," Marcus said again, like repeating it might make it land softer the 2nd time. "You'll still have a room. It's just going to be the one at the end of the hall past the laundry." The one at the end of the hall past the laundry was, and I want you to picture this clearly, a converted storage room, no closet to speak of, one small window facing the neighbor's fence, barely large enough for a twin bed, and a dresser pushed up against the same wall. It had been, until that Tuesday where they kept the vacuum, a rolling clothes rack, and 4 boxes of Priya's old textbooks. I asked him, standing there in the doorway of the room I'd called mine for 8 years, whether there'd been any discussion about this before the clipboard showed up, whether Priya and he had talked it through, weighed other options, maybe a smaller nursery setup in a corner of their own bedroom for the first year the way plenty of new parents manage. Marcus shifted his weight, a little uncomfortable, and admitted that Priya had really set her heart on the window in this room, the natural light, said it would be good for the baby. I remember standing there thinking that my own comfort, my own dignity, had apparently never made it into that conversation at all, that the decision had been made and finalized before I'd even been told there was a decision to make. I'm not saying any of this to be bitter. I'm saying it because it's true, and because you need to understand what 8 years of living in my son's house had quietly taught me about my own place in it, before I tell you what happened next. I raised 2 children in a house, Donna, and I built plank by plank on weekends, back when neither of us had 2 nickels to rub together, and a mortgage felt like the biggest risk either of us had ever taken. Marcus was always the ambitious one, the one who left for college and never quite looked back, who called on holidays and sent flowers on my birthday, and built a life that looked from the outside exactly like the life a father hopes for. My daughter Lauren stayed closer to home, became a home health aide, the kind of work that pays little and asks a great deal, the kind of work Priya once described at a Thanksgiving dinner I still think about as sweet, but not exact. Donna used to say, back when the kids were young, that Marcus was going to run a company someday, and Lauren was going to run toward whoever needed her most. And she never once meant it as a comparison that ranked one above the other, though I think, looking back, that the rest of the world heard it that way regardless. Donna died when Lauren was 26 and Marcus was 30, a sudden heart attack that gave none of us any warning. And I remember, in the terrible weeks that followed, that it was Lauren who moved back into my house for 2 months to make sure I wasn't alone with my grief, taking unpaid leave from a job that couldn't really afford to lose her, while Marcus sent flowers and called every few days from wherever his career had taken him that year. I remember, in particular, one night about 3 weeks after the funeral, unable to sleep, coming downstairs to find Lauren sitting at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning going through old photo albums, tears on her face, not making a sound because she didn't want to wake me. I sat with her a long while that night, the two of us looking at pictures of her mother from before either of the kids were born, and I remember thinking, even in the depths of that grief, that there was something remarkable about a 26-year-old woman who could set aside her own life so completely to make sure her father wasn't drowning alone in his. Marcus called that same week. A good call, a kind one, but a call all the same. 12 minutes on the phone from a hotel room in Atlanta before he had to get back to a client dinner. I sold that house 4 years later, once my own health started making the stairs and the yard work more than I could reasonably manage alone. And Marcus was the one who suggested, gently, reasonably, that I move in with him and Priya instead of into some assisted living facility that would eat through my savings for a fraction of the dignity. I remember how grateful I was for that offer, how it felt, at the time, like exactly the kind of security a father hopes his children will eventually offer back. I remember the day I moved in, 8 years ago now. Marcus and Priya had painted the guest room a warm sage green because Donna had always loved that color, a small gesture that meant more to me than either of them probably realized at the time. Priya had put fresh flowers on the dresser, real ones, not the silk kind, and told me, with what seemed like genuine warmth back then, that this was going to be my home for as long as I wanted it to be. I believed her. I want you to understand that, because it matters for how much the years since have actually cost me. Watching that warmth cool slowly into something closer to management. The way you might manage an aging piece of property you're obligated to maintain but no longer particularly enjoy. That first year was good, genuinely good Sunday dinners that felt like family instead of obligation. Priya asking my advice about the garden, Marcus stopping by my room some evenings just to talk about nothing in particular the way he used to when he was a boy. I don't know exactly when that started to change. There wasn't one single moment I could point to, just a slow accumulation of smaller absences, dinners that got shorter, conversations that got thinner, until 8 years had passed and I'd become, without either of us quite deciding it on purpose, something closer to a long-term house guest than a father. That comment about Lauren's work sat with me longer than I let on that day at Thanksgiving. I remember watching Lauren's face when Priya said it, the small, practiced way she absorbed it without argument, and thinking even then that there was something wrong with a family that could say a thing like that about a woman who spent her working hours bathing and feeding people other families had decided weren't worth the trouble anymore. If you've made it this far, Tell me in the comments which one of my children you think actually understood what family means, because I promise you, it wasn't the one with the 5-bedroom colonial. The move happened over a single weekend. Marcus and a rented dolly. Priya directing traffic from the hallway with her clipboard. The whole operation conducted with the brisk efficiency of people clearing out a storage unit rather than relocating a 71-year-old man's entire life. My good dresser didn't fit against the wall the way the old one had, so half my clothes stayed folded in suitcases stacked in the corner. My reading chair, the one Donna had bought me for our 30th anniversary, had to go into the garage because there simply wasn't floor space left once the bed and dresser were in. I remember standing in the doorway of that narrow back room that first evening, looking at the single small window facing the neighbor's fence instead of the yard, at the dresser jutting out at an angle because there was nowhere else for it to go, and feeling something settle over me that I didn't have words for yet, something quieter than anger and heavier than disappointment. Priya came by to check on the unpacking around dinner time, glanced around the room with a critical eye, and mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the space would work fine once we got you a smaller dresser eventually, like the problem was the furniture and not the 4 feet of floor space I now had to navigate my whole life inside of. I didn't complain. I want you to understand that, because it matters for what comes later. I told myself it was temporary, the way Marcus had promised, and I told myself a man my age shouldn't need much room anyway. And I spent the first several weeks in that narrow back room convincing myself that gratitude for a roof over my head should be enough to make the size of the room underneath it beside the point. There was an evening about 3 weeks in, Marcus and Priya having friends over for dinner, laughter and wine carrying down the hallway from the dining room while I sat on the edge of my narrow bed, with a plate I'd been handed through the doorway, because there wasn't room to set up a proper place for me at whatever gathering was happening that night. I don't think either of them meant it unkindly. I think by then, they'd simply stopped factoring me into the shape of an evening the same way they once had, the way you stop noticing a piece of furniture you've walked past every day for years. It was a Thursday evening, 6 weeks into living in that back room, when I got up in the night to use the bathroom and caught my hip on the corner of the dresser, the one that didn't fit properly against the wall, in a room too cramped for a man my age to navigate safely in the dark. I went down hard on the floor, and I lay there a long moment before I found the strength to call out, and it was Priya, not Marcus, who eventually heard me and came to check, took one look at me on that floor between the bed and the dresser, and the first thing out of her mouth wasn't "Are you hurt?" It was "We really do need to get that dresser measured properly this time." I lay there on that floor a moment longer after she'd gone to wake Marcus, staring up at a ceiling I'd stared at every night for 6 weeks, and I remember thinking, with a clarity that surprised me even through the pain in my hip, that I had spent 8 years quietly shrinking myself to fit the space my son's family was willing to make for me, and that the room had finally, physically, caught up with exactly how small that space had become. Welcome back to Brian's Revenge if you're just joining, and if you haven't already, subscribe for more stories like this one, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Because that fall is the reason everything about the next several months happened the way it did. The hip wasn't broken, but it was badly bruised, and Dr. Akaffer at the clinic told me plainly that at my age, a fall like that one was nothing to treat lightly, that I needed rest, mobility support, and above all, she said, looking at me carefully, an environment that doesn't put you at risk of it happening again. I didn't tell her about the dresser. I didn't need to. She could see it in the particular way I described the room, cramped, no clear path from the bed to the door, and she wrote something in my chart I wasn't shown, and recommended I have someone stay with me for the next several weeks while I recovered. I called Marcus from that clinic waiting room, my hip aching, and asked whether he could take some time to help me through the recovery, whether we might finally talk about moving that dresser, clearing a proper path, maybe even reconsidering the room itself given what Dr. Acaffer had said. "Dad," he said, his voice carrying that particular patience people use when they've decided a conversation is an inconvenience rather than a request. "I hear you, but Priya's due date is getting close, and honestly, rearranging your room again right now just isn't something we have bandwidth for. Can you manage a few weeks with what you've got? We'll sort it out properly once the baby's here. I never asked you for anything in 8 years, Marcus. Not once." "I know, Dad, and I'm not saying no forever, just not right now. There's a lot going on." I hung up and sat in that clinic parking lot a long while, my hip throbbing, understanding, in a way I hadn't quite let myself understand before, that whatever room my son had left for his father in his actual life had a shape to it now, and that shape had gotten smaller right alongside the actual room I was sleeping in. I called Lauren that same afternoon, ashamed in the particular way you get ashamed asking your daughter, the one this family has spent years quietly calling sweet but not exactly a career, for help her more comfortable brother had just declined to give. "Dad, stop," she said, the second I started explaining. "I'm coming to get you tonight. Lauren, I can't ask you to. You're not asking." I heard her keys jingling already on her end of the line. "I've got a fold-out I can set up in the living room for myself, and you're taking my bed. That's not up for discussion, Dad. Lauren, that's your only bedroom. It's a room, Dad." She said it like it was the simplest math in the world. "You're not a room. Stop arguing and let me help you pack." She showed up at Marcus's house within the hour, helped me gather what I needed from that cramped back bedroom, and drove me to her small one-bedroom apartment across town, where she'd already made up her own bed with fresh sheets and cleared her closet to make room for my clothes. She took the fold-out couch in her living room that night, and every night after, for the next several months, without once treating it like a sacrifice worth mentioning. I sat on the edge of that bed my first night in her apartment, and wept the way I hadn't let myself weep in 8 years of quietly making myself smaller in my son's house. She's the only one who ever really saw me, I thought, sitting there while my daughter, the one nobody in this family had ever called successful, gave up the one private space she owned in the world without a single moment's hesitation. I had no idea, sitting there that first night, just how much that gesture was about to matter, or what was still sitting in a filing cabinet from 8 years earlier, waiting on me. But that's still ahead of us. Let me tell you what those months in Lauren's apartment looked like first, because you need to understand what she kept giving before you'll understand what I did with what I found. Lauren worked her full shifts at the home health agency and came home every evening to check my hip, help me with the exercises Dr. Acaffer had prescribed, and never once, not one single time, made me feel like a burden folded into her already small life. She'd sit with me some evenings on the edge of that bed, both of us watching whatever was on her little television, and she'd tell me about her patients, the ones who tipped her in small kindnesses because they couldn't afford anything else, the landlord who still hadn't fixed her water heater, ordinary things that felt, in that apartment, like the only real conversation I'd had in years. There was an evening about a month into my stay, Lauren coming home later than usual, still in her scrubs, exhausted in a way I could see settling into her shoulders before she'd even said a word. She'd picked up an extra shift that day, she told me, one of her regular clients needing extended hours after a scare at the hospital, and she'd said yes without hesitation even though her own body was clearly asking for rest. I asked her gently, whether she ever resented the demands of that work, the way it asked so much of her for so little in return. She thought about it a long moment before she answered. "Sometimes, Dad," she admitted. "But then I think about how it would feel to be the person nobody showed up for, and I can't make myself be the reason somebody feels that way." I sat with that answer a long while after she'd gone to sleep on her fold-out couch, thinking about how thoroughly that same instinct had shaped the last several months of my own life inside her small apartment. Another evening, closer to the 2-month mark, Lauren came home with a proper reading chair she'd found secondhand at an estate sale, small enough to fit in the corner of her bedroom, and set it up without a word of explanation. Just moved a side table to make room and gestured for me to sit in it that evening while we watched television together. I asked her how much it had cost, worried, the way I'd worried about every small expense she'd taken on for my sake those months, and she waved the question off the way she waves off most things people worry about on her behalf. "Found it for $20, Dad. Don't make it a whole thing." I sat in that chair that evening and thought about Donna's anniversary chair sitting in Marcus's garage, forgotten, and about how my daughter, with far less to spare, had found a way to make sure I still had somewhere comfortable to sit in a house I actually belonged in. There was a particular Saturday morning, maybe 6 weeks into my stay, when Lauren didn't have a shift, and we spent the whole morning together at her small kitchen table, her working through crossword puzzles while I read the paper. And I remember feeling, sitting there in that cramped little kitchen with barely enough counter space for 2 coffee mugs, more at home than I'd felt in 8 years in Marcus's 5-bedroom colonial. She asked me out of nowhere whether I missed the old house, the one Donna and I had built, and I told her the truth, that I missed it every single day, but that I'd started to understand something about home that had nothing to do with square footage at all. She smiled at that, a small, tired smile, and went back to her crossword without saying much else, but I could tell the answer had landed somewhere real in her. I remember, too, an evening when Lauren came home unusually quiet, and it took some gentle prodding before she told me what had happened at work that day. A longtime patient of hers, an elderly woman named Mrs. Pemberton she'd been caring for over a year, had passed away that morning alone, because the family Mrs. Pemberton had spent her whole life building had stopped visiting months earlier. Lauren had been the one holding her hand when it happened. I watched my daughter carry that weight quietly that evening, still finding the energy afterward to check my hip, to ask about my day, to make sure I'd taken my evening medication. And I understood, watching her, exactly what kind of person absorbs that much of other people's pain and still has room left over for her own father's small, ordinary needs. Marcus called twice in those months. Asked how the hip was healing in a tone that suggested he was checking a box rather than actually wondering. Never once asked whether the room situation might need revisiting. Never once offered to help with anything beyond a card that arrived with a generic "get well" message and no return address forwarded, I later learned, by an assistant at his office. That's the difference, I thought, watching Lauren fall asleep on that fold-out couch one night, still in her scrubs, too tired to change before she drifted off. Marcus gives when it costs him nothing and calls it generosity. Lauren gives everything she has and calls it Tuesday. It was on one of those quiet evenings, going through a box of old paperwork I'd asked Lauren to bring from a storage unit I still paid for, that I came across a manila folder I hadn't opened in 8 years. The paperwork from the down payment gift I'd given Marcus, the one my elder law attorney at the time, a careful man named Desmond Osgood, had insisted on documenting properly instead of just handing over as a simple gift. I remembered, vaguely, Desmond explaining something about a support agreement at the time, and I remembered being mildly annoyed at how much paperwork he'd wanted for what felt, back then, like a simple act of love toward my son. I read it now, 8 years later, sitting on the edge of my daughter's bed with my hip still aching, slower and more carefully than I had the first time. Here we go, I thought at first. Just another form document I'd signed without much thought at the time. Then I got to the third page, and I read it twice, then a third time because I didn't trust my own eyes. The agreement stated, in language Desmond had clearly drafted with exactly this kind of situation in mind, that the $85,000 gift toward the down payment was contingent upon the recipient, Marcus, providing reasonably adequate housing and care for me for the remainder of my life, or until such arrangement was mutually terminated. Should that condition be breached, as determined by documented evidence of inadequate housing, care, or safety, the gift would automatically convert to a loan, accruing interest retroactive to the date of the original gift, secured by a lien against the property it had helped purchase. I sat there on Lauren's bed with that document in my hands like it might go off if I moved too fast. 8 years of interest, I thought, on $85,000. And a fall in a room too cramped to safely navigate, documented in a clinic chart by a doctor who'd clearly written down more than she'd told me directly. I remember sitting there a long while after reading it, thinking back to the afternoon I'd first signed that document, Desmond's office smelling faintly of coffee, Marcus waiting in the car outside because he'd said he didn't need to sit through the paperwork. He trusted me to handle it. I'd felt a small flicker of hurt at the time that he hadn't wanted to be part of a conversation about protecting his own inheritance and my own care. And I understood now, all these years later, that his absence from that room had meant he genuinely never bothered to learn what the document actually said, had simply signed where his own attorney told him to sign, and moved on with his life, the way people do with paperwork they've decided doesn't apply to them. That's the moment something in me went quiet and cold and very, very clear. I didn't call Marcus. I want you to remember that because it matters for what comes later. I never went looking for a reason to take something from my son. I simply stopped protecting him from a document he'd never once bothered to remember existed, the same document his own attorney had reviewed and approved 8 years earlier without objection. I called Desmond Osgood, still practicing, still every bit as careful as I remembered. Desmond, it's Norman Callahan. I need you to pull an old file. The support agreement you drafted for me 8 years ago tied to a down payment gift to my son. I remember it very well, Norman. What's happened? I told him everything. The room, the fall, Dr. Acker's notes, Marcus's refusal to address it even after the hip. Desmond was quiet a moment before he answered. Norman, based on what you're describing, this looks like a clear breach. Inadequate housing leading directly to a documented injury, followed by a refusal to remedy it despite medical recommendation. That's exactly the scenario this agreement was built to address. I'll need the clinic records, but if they confirm what you're telling me, the conversion clause activates. The gift becomes a loan, retroactive interest included, and it's secured against the house. We're likely looking at a repayment obligation well over $150,000 at this point. I asked him, my voice not entirely steady, whether Marcus would have any real way to fight the claim, whether 8 years of assumed generosity could simply be undone this cleanly by a piece of paper he barely remembered signing. Desmond was quiet a moment before he answered. Norman, he signed it with his own attorney present, reviewing every page. The language is unambiguous, and the documentation you're describing, the clinic notes especially, gives us exactly what we'd need to demonstrate breach clearly. He has options to contest it, certainly, but I'd be surprised if his own attorney advised him to fight this once they see the actual paperwork and the medical record behind it. I sat there in Lauren's small kitchen a long while after that call, thinking about a dresser that never fit properly against a wall, about a daughter who'd given up her own bed without a second thought. Desmond, I want to move on this quietly. I don't want a single soul outside this call knowing until it's filed, not even Marcus, especially not Marcus. I thought about Lauren asleep on that fold-out couch in her scrubs. Whatever comes from this, I want it structured as a trust. Sole beneficiary, Lauren Callahan. Enough for a real down payment on a place of her own, something with more than one bedroom in it. Desmond didn't say anything for a second. All of it, Norman. The full recovery, after my own care costs and your fees, every dollar, yes. She gave me her only bedroom without me having to ask twice. Meanwhile, my son measured how much space I was allowed to take up in his own house with an actual clipboard. So no, I'm not splitting this for the sake of looking fair. Fair already happened on a fold-out couch, and only one of my children was ever part of it. I hear you, Norman. I'll have this moving within the month. I hung up the phone and sat there in that small kitchen a long while, listening to Lauren's breathing from the next room, thinking about a filing cabinet's worth of paperwork that had waited 8 years for somebody to actually need it. They're going to find out eventually. And when they do, they're not going to ask about my hip. They're going to ask about the house. I wasn't wrong about that part. I want you to hold on to that thought because it's exactly what happened, but not the way I expected, and not for the reason I expected. If you've stuck with this story all the way through, that tells me something about the kind of person you are, and I think you're going to want to see how Marcus finds out. Because he doesn't find out from me. He finds out the way I always suspected he would, through a lien notice attached to a house he thought was entirely his own. 6 weeks after that call with Desmond, Marcus called me at 8 in the evening, his voice tight in a way I recognized right away. Dad, I need you to explain something to me. Something showed up on our property today, a lien notice from an attorney's office. $158,000. Dad, what is going on? I filed a claim under the support agreement, Marcus, I said steady. The one your own attorney reviewed 8 years ago. The one that said if you couldn't provide adequate housing and care for me, that down payment gift converted to a loan. That's not, he started and stopped. Dad, that agreement was just boilerplate, Desmond's idea. I barely remember signing off on it. You remember it well enough now, I said. It seems to be doing a lot of work for you tonight. There was a long silence on the line. 20 minutes later, headlights swept across Lauren's apartment parking lot. Marcus's car, alone. Dad, we need to talk about this right now, he said. The moment I opened Lauren's door, something anxious underneath the composure he usually carried so easily. You can't just do this without talking to me first. Do you understand what this does to us financially? Neither of us has said one word yet about my hip, I said. Not one word about how the recovery's going. Straight to the money. That tells me everything I need to know about where your priorities actually sat this whole time. Marcus stood in that doorway a long moment, hands jammed into his jacket pockets, and I watched him take in Lauren's small apartment behind me, the fold-out couch still unfolded from the night before, my reading chair in the corner, the whole modest scene laid out plain in front of a man used to 5 bed. You can't just do this, Dad, he said again, quieter this time, some of the earlier anger giving way to something closer to disbelief. $158,000. That's most of our equity. Do you understand what this could do to us? I understand exactly what it could do, Marcus, I said steady. I understand it a great deal better than you understood what moving me into a storage room could do to me. That's not fair, he said. That room wasn't permanent, Dad. 6 weeks isn't permanent, I agreed. But 6 weeks was long enough for me to fall in the dark because a dresser didn't fit against a wall properly, Marcus. Long enough for your wife to check whether the furniture needed remeasuring before she asked whether I was hurt. Long enough for you to tell me, from a clinic parking lot with my hip aching, that rearranging my room just wasn't something you had bandwidth for. He was quiet for a moment, and I watched something shift behind his eyes, the particular stillness of a man doing math he badly wanted to come out differently than it was going to. Dad, I didn't realize it had gotten that bad. I swear I didn't understand what that room actually looked like day to day. You didn't understand because you never once came to look, I said, and my voice caught slightly on that sentence, the only moment in the whole conversation where the calm nearly slipped. You measured a floor plan on a clipboard, Marcus. You never once measured what it actually felt like to live inside it. He put his head down for a moment, and when he looked back up there was something raw in his face I hadn't seen from him in years. Not since he was a much younger man standing at his mother's funeral trying to hold himself together in front of relatives he barely knew. "Is this about punishing me?" he asked. "Or is it about the money?" "It's about neither," I said. "It's about a document your own attorney reviewed and approved 8 years ago, sitting dormant the entire time you provided a decent life for your father, exactly the way it was designed to sit dormant. It only ever mattered the moment you stopped providing that. You're the one who activated it, Marcus, not me. I just stopped protecting you from the consequences of your own choices." He sat down slowly on the arm of Lauren's fold-out couch, some of the fight draining out of his posture entirely, replaced by something closer to exhaustion. "What do you want from me, Dad?" he asked, his voice smaller now than I'd heard it in years. "I don't need anything from you right now," I said. "I need you to understand what's already been decided because it's already done, and no amount of explaining is going to undo it. I filed the claim. Desmond's moving forward. Whatever comes from it goes into a trust for your sister." Marcus's head came up sharply at that. "All of it. To Lauren, every dollar," I said. "She gave me her bedroom without me having to ask twice, Marcus. Slept on a fold-out couch for months without one single complaint. You measured how much space I was allowed to take up in your own house with an actual clipboard. I'm not splitting this evenly for the sake of looking fair. Fair already happened on that fold-out couch, and only one of my children was ever part of it." He sat there a long moment, quiet, staring at a spot on the carpet, and when he finally spoke again, his voice had lost almost all its earlier edge. "I don't know how to fix this, Dad. I don't know if there's anything I can even say right now that would make this better. There isn't, not tonight," I told him honestly. "This isn't the kind of thing that gets repaired in a single conversation in your sister's doorway, no matter how sorry you're feeling sitting there right now. It's going to take a lot longer than it took you to decide a storage room was good enough for your father." Lauren appeared in the hallway behind me then, still in her scrubs from her shift, having clearly heard most of the conversation from the kitchen, and she didn't say anything at first, just came to stand beside me, steady the way she'd been steady through every single one of these last several months. Marcus looked at his sister for a long moment, something passing across his face that might have been the beginning of shame, or might only have been the shock of watching $158,000 walk out of his equity and into her name in the space of a single conversation. I honestly couldn't tell you which. Not that night. And I'm still not entirely sure now. Priya, I said, would want to know it started with a dresser that never fit properly against a wall. I'd like you to think about that carefully before you decide how you feel about any of this, Marcus. Not the number, the dresser." He didn't answer right away. He sat there on the arm of that fold-out couch, elbows on his knees, staring at nothing in particular, and for a long moment none of us said anything at all, the three of us occupying that small living room in a silence that felt, strangely, more honest than most of the conversations we'd had in the 8 years since I'd moved into his house. "I want to see the room," he finally said, so quiet I almost didn't catch it. "The one you're in now. Lauren's room. I want to actually see it before I say anything else about any of this." I looked at him for a long moment, surprised by the request, and something in his face told me he meant it, that some part of him had finally started to understand that the conversation we were having wasn't really about money at all, not underneath everything else. Lauren showed him back to the bedroom without a word, and I heard him standing in that doorway a long while, taking in the space that was smaller than his own walk-in closet back at the Colonial, the fresh sheets, the reading chair found for $20 at an estate sale, everything about it modest and worn and given without a single condition attached. He came back out a few minutes later, quieter still, and sat back down on that couch arm like something in him had shifted in that short walk down the hallway and back. "This is smaller than the room you were in at our place," he said, more to himself than to either of us. "Even the storage room, it is," I confirmed. "And your sister gave it to me without blinking, Marcus. Without a clipboard, without a floor plan. She just said it's yours now and meant it." He nodded slowly, and I watched him work through something private in his own mind for a long moment before he spoke again. "I don't know what to do with any of this tonight, Dad. I mean that honestly. I came over here angry about a lien notice, and now I don't even know what I'm angry about anymore. That's honest, at least," I said. "It's more honest than anything you said to me in that clinic parking lot 6 weeks ago." He left a little while after that, quieter than he'd arrived. No slammed door, no final ultimatum. Just a man walking back out to his car with a great deal more to think about than he'd driven in with. I watched his taillights pull out of the parking lot from Lauren's front window, and I felt Lauren come to stand beside me again, her shoulder just barely touching mine the way it had so many evenings those past several months. "You okay, Dad?" she asked. "I will be." For the first time in 8 years, I actually believed it when I said it. That's where I'm going to leave this for now. Because what comes next, between a son finally starting to understand the true size of what he'd measured away with a clipboard, and a daughter who never once needed a document to know what family actually required of her, that's a conversation that's still unfolding in real time, in a small apartment that had somehow, without anybody planning it that way, become the only place in this whole story that ever really felt like home. Stay with me. Part 2 picks up exactly where this one stops, right there in that doorway, and it does not go the way he drove over here expecting.